Great Tov, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Great to be back in our beautiful sanctuary here. And finally, remember to turn the heat on, so quite so freezing, which is always good. I hope wherever you are warm and comfortable and excited to celebrate Shabbat with all of you. So we'll begin as we always do with just a little warm-up singing, and you're welcome to join me now. Yallai lai 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 yallai lai 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 yallai lai 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 yallai lai 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 yallai lai 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 yai lai lai Shalom, everyone. We're now on page 186 as we begin our service together with thanks and gratitude. Modeh lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Modeh lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. Thanks to you, Adonai, ever living sovereign, that you have restored my soul to me in mercy. How great is your trust. Turn now to page 192, the very top of the page. Matovu alecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. Let's read together now on the top of page 194 in Hebrew, a blessing for our bodies. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher yatzar et adam b'chokhmah, u'barav nekavim nekavim, chalulim chalulim, galui v'yadua lifnei chisei chavodecha, she'im yipatech echad mehem, o yisatem echad mehem, yefshar litkayem u'la'amod lefanecha. Baruch atah Adonai rofech chol basar u'mafli la'asot. We turn now to page 196 as we offer prayer for our souls. Elohai neshama shenatata bi tehorahim. 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 Join with me on the top of page 197. Matter is never destroyed, only transformed. So too can the soul evolve higher and higher, from instinct to inspiration, haughtiness to holiness, selfishness to service, from individualism to union, to join with the soul of souls, the infinite one. As the soul is magnified and sanctified, so is the infinite one exalted. Baruch atah Adonai, asher bi'ado nefesh kol chai, ve'ruach kol besar ish. Rise in body or spirit as we turn to page 198. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lasach b'bina labchin b'yom u'b'layla, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rokaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzad gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam albish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten le'aev koach. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavir she'ena meinai u'tenuma me'af apai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani b'tzelem Elohim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tifara. If you're still standing at home, please be seated. We're on page 204. We're going to read together in Hebrew, first at the very top of the page, and then the English at the bottom. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. O Adonai our God, let the words of Torah be sweet in our mouths and the mouths of your people Israel, so that we, our descendants, and the descendants of all your people Israel, may know you by studying your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Adonai, who teaches Torah to your people Israel. Baruch atah Adonai hamelamed Torah le'amo Yisrael. Now on page 206. Elu devarim she'ein lahem shiur, she'adam ochel perotehem ba'olam hazeh, v'akeren kayemet lo le'olam haba, ve'elu hein kibud avayim u'gemilut chasadim, והשכמת בית המדרש שחרית וערבית, והכנסת אורחים וביקור חולים, והכנסת כלה ולוויית המת ועיון תפילה, והבאת שלום בין אדם לחברו, ותלמוד תורה כנגד כולם. We now rise for the opening blessing of Bizuki Zimmer on page 212 in body or spirit. Baruch she'amar ve'haya olam baruch hu, Baruch hoseh bereshit, Baruch omer ve'yoseh, Baruch gozer u'mekayem, Baruch merachem al haaretz, Baruch merachem al habriot, Baruch meshalem sachar tov lireav, Baruch chai la'ad v'kayam lanetzach, Baruch pohodeh u'matziel, Baruch shemo. Bishvachot u'bizmirot negadelcha, u'nshabecha napayecha v'nazkir shimcha v'namlicha malkeinu Eloheinu, Yachid chei olamim, melech meshubach u'mochorei ad shemo hagadol, Baruch atah Adonai, Melech mehulal batishbachot. Please be seated. We're now on page 214, second line down from the top of the page. Tov lehodol Adonai, Tov lehodol Adonai, ulezamer, Leshimcha Elyon, Tov lehodot l'Adonai, lehagid baboker chasdecha, lehagid baboker chasdecha, ve'emunatcha b'halelot, ve'emunatcha b'halelot, Tov lehodot l'Adonai, alei asur v'alei navel, alei gayon bechinor, Yisimchtani Adonai befoalecha, v'maasei yadecha ranen, magadu maasecha ya, me'od מחשבותיך. מה גדלו מעשיך היה, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. מה גדלו מעשיך היה, מאוד עמקו מחשבותיך. We're now in 215, Ashrei beginning at the top of the page, and then we'll continue silently on to the next. Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, Od Yehalelucha, Od Yehalelucha. Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, Od Yehalelucha, Od Yehalelucha. Selah Sheyaham Shekagalosh. V'anachnu nevarech ya, me'ata v'ad olam, me'ata v'ad olam, me'ata v'ad olam. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. We're now on page 218. Hallelujah, 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 El Bekodsho, hallelujah, Bekiauzo, hallelujah, Bigvurotav, hallelujah, Kerokulo, hallelujah, 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 beteka shofar, hallelujah, benever bechinor, hallelujah, betofu machor, hallelujah, beminim veugam, hallelujah, 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 betziatzalei shama, hallelujah, betziatzalei chua, kol hanshama tehallelujah, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. We're now on page 219. Nishmat kol achai tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu. We continue silently to the bottom of the page. We're now on page 220. Ilu ofinu malei shira kayam, ul shoneinu rina kamod galam, ves ושפתותינו שבח כמרחבי רקיע, ועינינו מאירות כשמש וכירח, וידינו פרוסות כנשרי שמיים, ורגלינו קלות כחיילות. אין אנחנו מספיקים להודות לך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו, לברך שפנו תישא לי על חלום. We're now on page 222, the middle paragraph in Hebrew. Shochen ad marom v'kadosh shemo v'chatur v'hanenu tzadikim b'Adonai la'yesharim na'avat tehilam befi yesharim tit'alau divrei tzadikim tit'barachu b'lashon chasidim tit'romamu b'kerev kedoshim tit'kadashu b'makehalot rivevot amcha beit Yisrael berinait ba'ar Shimcha makeinu bechol dor Vador yababai yababai bye 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 yababai yababai bye bye yababai bye 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 yababai bye 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 ay babai ay bye bye Yishtabach shimcha la'ad malkeinu Ha'el ha'melech ha'gadol v'ha'kadosh b'shamayim u'ba'aretz Ki lecha na'e Adonai Eloheinu v'Elokei avotenu ve'imotenu Sherushvachal v'Zimmer ha'uzu memshala netzach Gedula ugura tila v'tiferet kedusha u'malchut Brachot ve'hodaot me'ata v'yad olam Baruch ata Adonai El melech gadol batishpachot El ha'hodaot Adon ha'niflaot Habocher b'shirei zimra Melech elechei ha'olamim. We're on page 224, we are rising in body or spirit. Yitkada v'yitkada shemei rabba Be'alma divra chirutei B'yamlich malchutei V'chayechon v'yamechon V'chayei dechol beit Yisrael V'hagala v'yizman kariv Yimeru amen Yesh me'rabba mevarach Le'alam le'almei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtabach V'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shemei dekudsha b'richu Le'elam in kol birchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechamata Damirat ve'abba v'imeru Amen. We're on page 226. Barechu et Adonai hamevorach Baruch Adonai hamevorach le'olam va'ed. If you're still standing, please be seated. We're now on page 228. We'll begin by reading the English together at the bottom of the page and then the 3 lines in Hebrew just above. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe, creator of light and darkness, who makes peace and fashions all things. In mercy you illumine the world and those who live upon it. In your goodness you daily renew creation. How numerous are your works, Adonai, in wisdom you formed them all, filling the earth with your creatures. Be praised, Adonai, our God, for the excellent work of your hands. and for the lights you created, may they glorify you. Shine a new light upon Zion, that we all may swiftly merit its radiance. Praised are you, Adonai, creator of all heavenly lights. Or Chadash al Tzion Tahir. Or Chadash al Tzion Tahir. V'nizkechu lanu meheira leoro. V'nizkechu lanu meheira leoro. Yadadai bim bim bam, yadadai bim bam, yadadai bim bim bam, yadadai. Yadadai bim bim bam, yadadai bim bam, yadadai bim bim bam, yadadai. Baruch atah Adonai, Yotzer HaMeorot. We're now on page 230. We're going to begin by reading the English together at the top of the page, and then the Hebrew at the bottom. How deeply you have loved us, Adonai our God, gracing us with surpassing compassion. On account of our forebears whose trust led you to teach them the laws of life, be gracious to us, teaching us as well. O merciful one, have mercy on us by making us able to understand and discern, to heed, learn, and teach, and lovingly to observe, perform, and fulfill all that is in your Torah. V'ha'erinenu b'toratecha v'dahavek libeinu b'mitzvotecha v'yachel levaveinu le'ahava u'yira et shemecha v'lo nebosh v'lo nikalem v'lo nikashel le'olam va'ed ki b'shem kochecha agadol ve'anora batachnu nagila v'nismecha b'yeshuatecha ve'avienu le'shalom me'arba kanfot haaretz ve'tolichenu komemiut le'artzeinu ki el poel yeshuot ata uvanu v'acharta ve'kerabtanu le'shimcha hagadol sela be'emet leodot lecha yechidcha b'yahava baruch atah Adonai abocher b'amo Yisrael b'yahava. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We're now on page 234. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol lebavcha v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol meodecha ve'hayu advarim ha'ele asher anochi metzavcha hayom al levavecha ve'shinatam levanecha v'dibarta bam ve'shivtecha b'veitecha u'v'lechtecha b'derech u'shofbecha u'kumecha וקשרתם להיות הידיך והיו לטוטפות ביניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We're now on page 236. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם ונגנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת והיה לכם לציצית ראיתם אותו וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני ועשיתם אותם ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם אשר אתם זונים אחריהם למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם אלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם אדוני אלוהיכם אמן. We're now on page 239. We'll read together in English at the top of the page. Emet, there is no place where you are not. Even in the wilderness, there is your word. Emet, that pen strokes of lightning, white fire, black flames, stir the soul's passion, guide our sacred way, true and enduring as Torah. Your truth for us is certain and established now and forevermore. Like Moses, Miriam, and all Israel, we sing out and rejoice. We're going to begin on page 238, 4 lines up from the bottom of the page, or almost the bottom of the page in Hebrew. Tehillah le'elyon baruch hu mevorach Moshe u'Miriam u'bnei Yisrael lechanu shira lesimcha rabba ve'yamru chulam mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai mi kamocha nedar ba'kodesh nora te'ilot osef elem yai lai 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 shira chadasha shipchu geulim leshimcha al sfat hayam yachad kulam hodu ve'imlichu ve'ameru Adonai himloch le'olam va'ed Adonai himloch le'olam va'ed Tzur Yisrael Kuma be'ezrat Yisrael ufedechenu mecha Yehuda ve'Yisrael Go aleinu Adonai tzvaot shemo kedosh Yisrael Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. We begin the Amidah together on page 242 and then continue silently. Please go at your own pace, and when you're finished, if you are standing, you may be seated. Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. If you are still davening your silent Amidah, please continue and you can catch up with us. If you are finished, and if you so choose to rise in body or spirit, we're on page 324 for the repetition of the Amidah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avotenu Imotenu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor HaNorah El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim Vekoneh HaKol Vezocher Chasdei Avot Ve'imahot Umevei Geula Livnei B'neihem Leman Shemo B'Yahvah Melech Ozer U'Moshiach U'Magen Baruch atah Adonai Magen Abraham Bezrat Sarah אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע. משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים. צומח נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בגבורות, ומדומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה. ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני לחיי המתים. We're on page 326. נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמי מרום, ככתוב על יד אביך, וקרא זה אל זה ואמר, קדוש קדוש קדוש, אדוני צבאות, מלוך כל הארץ, כבודו. אדיר אדירנו אדוני אדוננו, מאדיר שמך בכל הארץ, ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. אחד הוא אלוהינו, אבינו מלכנו, ומושיענו והוא ישמיענו, ברחמיו לעיני כל חי. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהיך ציון, לדור ודור. Hallelujah. We're now on page 328. לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד כל לך, לדור ודור, לדור ודור, לדור ודור נגיד כל לך, ולנצח נצחים קדושתך להקדיש, קדושתך להקדיש. ושבחך אלוהינו מפינו לא ימוש לעולם לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש. You're still standing, you may be seated. We're now on the top of page 329. ישמחו במלכותך שומרי 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 שבת וקוראי עונג שבת. ישמחו במלכותך שומרי 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 שבת וקוראי עונג שבת. מקדשי מקדשי שמי שבת, כולם ישמעו ויתענגו מטובך שבת. ישמחו במלכותך שומרי 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 שבת וקוראי עונג שבת. והשביעי רצית בו וקידשתו שבת. חבנת ימים אותו קראת שבת. ישמחו במלכותך שומרי 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 שבת וקוראי עונג שבת. זכר למעשה למעשה בראשית שבת. זכר למעשה למעשה בראשית שבת. ישמחו במלכותך שומרי 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 שבת וקוראי עונג שבת. אלוהינו אלוהי אבותינו ואמותינו, רצה רצה במנוחתנו. קדשנו במצוותיך ותן חלקנו בתורתך. שמנו מטובך ושמחנו משועתך. וטהר ליבנו Lecha be'emet ve'anchileinu Adonai Eloheinu Hailai lai 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 V'yavav ratzon Shabbat kodshecha v'nuchu v'Yisrael mekadshei shemecha Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh HaShabbat. We're now on page 330. We'll read together in English in the middle of the page. On this Shabbat day, as you graciously receive our prayers, help us to hear your call. Grant us enough health to fulfill our duties and the compassion we need to attend to others. Teach us humility that we may perceive our own faults, and grant us the wisdom to be forgiving of others. Give us the courage to be true to our highest selves and the charity to see the best in those around us. Give us patience enough not to become discouraged, hope enough to overcome all fears for the future, and faith enough to know your presence. O source of blessing, look with favor upon us. May our offerings be acceptable to you. Baruch atah Adonai, she'otcha levatcha birad navon. We're now on page 350. We'll read together, beginning at the bottom of the page in English, and end each paragraph together in Hebrew with the words Modim Anachnu Lach, offering our gratitude to God for all of these gifts. For the expanding grandeur of creation, worlds known and unknown, galaxies beyond galaxies filling us with awe and challenging our imaginations, Modim Anachnu Lach. For this fragile planet Earth, its times and tides, its sunsets and seasons, Modim Anachnu Lach. For the joy of human life, its wonders and surprises, its hopes and achievements, Modim Anachnu Lach. For human community, our common past and future hope, our oneness transcending all separation, our capacity to work for peace and justice in the midst of hostility and oppression, Modim Anachnu Lach. For high hopes and noble causes, for faith without fanaticism, for understanding of views not shared, Modim Anachnu Lach. For all who have labored and suffered for a fairer world, who have lived so that others might live in dignity and freedom, Modim Anachnu Lach. For human liberties and sacred rights, for opportunities to change and grow, to affirm and choose, Modim Anachnu Lach. We pray that we may live not by our fears, but by our hopes, not by our words, but by our deeds. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha lechaneh lehodot. We're now on page 334. Sim shalom tova ubracha chen v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha v'archeinu yotzreinu kulanu kechad ve'or panecha ki ve'or panecha natata lanu Adonai Eloheinu. Sim shalom tova ubracha chen v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha Torat chaim ve'ahavat chesed u'tzedaka u'bracha ve'rachamim v'chaim ve'shalom. Sim shalom tova u'bracha chen v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha ve'tov einecha levarech et amcha Yisrael v'chol eit u'v'chol shah b'shlomecha. Sim shalom tova u'bracha chen v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ha'amecha. Baruch atah Adonai hamevarech et amo Yisrael b'shalom. We Turn now to page 336. We'll read together in English at the bottom of the page. I need strength, humility, courage, patience, strength to control my passions, humility to assess my own worth, courage to rise above defeats, and patience to cleanse myself of imperfections, and wisdom to learn and live by our sacred teachings. Let me not be discouraged by my failings. Let me take heart from all that is good and noble in my character. Keep me from falling victim to cynicism. Teach me sincerity and enthusiasm. Endow me with perception and courage that I may serve others with compassion and love. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'yimeru amen. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit as we turn to page 362 for the beginning of the Torah service, Seder Kriyat HaTorah, again page 362 as the ark is open. אין כמוך אלוהים אדוני, ואין כמעשיך מלכותך, מלכות כל עולמים, וממשלתך בכל דור ודור. אדוני מלך, אדוני מלך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, אדוני יעוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. אבא הרחמים, היטיבה ברצונך את ציון, תבנה חומות ירושלים, כי בך לבד בטחנו, מלך אל ונישא, אדון עולמים. כי מציון תצא תורה, כי מציון תצא תורה, ודבר אדוני בירושלים. ברוך שנתן תורה תורה, ברוך שנתן תורה תורה לעמו ישראל, בקדושתו. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. אחד אלוהינו גדול, אדוננו קדוש שמו. גדול אדוני תהיו נרוממה, שמו יחדיו. לך אדוני הגדולה, והגבורה והתפארת, והנצח וההוד. כי כל בשמיים ובארץ, כי כל בשמיים ובארץ, לך אדוני הממלכה, והמתנשא לכל ראש. רוממו אדוני אלוהינו והשתחוו להקודשו. רוממו אדוני אלוהינו והשתחוו להקודשו. כי קדוש אדוני אלוהינו רוממו. כי קדוש אדוני אלוהינו רוממו. If you're still standing at home, please be seated. This morning we're going to read from Parshat Mishpatim, and in just a few moments after my drash, I'll be reading the fifth aliyah for Parshat Mishpatim, which begins with chapter 23, verse 6 of the book of Exodus. Again, chapter 23, verse 6 of the book of Exodus. If you are following at home in the Women's Torah Commentary, that reading will begin on page 439, and if you're following in the Plav Chumash, it will begin on page 520. So again, Plav Chumash, page 520, Women's Torah Commentary, page 439. But first, just a few words, a few things to share this morning. So Parshat Mishpatim, as I mentioned last night, the name gives away what the essence is of the Parsha. It is a Parsha that is filled with law, with a number of different statutes, many of which, again, which we'll study a little bit more in depth in our Torah study, are what you would call sort of the societal, I guess, the communal fabric laws, right? The ones that basically are addressed a lot of times to the things that we may take for granted until the situation happens to us, but basically gives the people of Israel for generations a baseline upon which to decide complicated judicial issues. And this takes the form, again, of mitzvot, both positive and negative, things that we are meant to do, things that we are meant not to do. And in certain cases, depending on when those things are violated, what an appropriate kind of punishment looks like. And we even get laws that have to do with how to consider and structure the legal system itself, how to consider the nature of the judge, how to consider the nature of the plaintiffs. All of these things are ultimately considered throughout the Torah in various kinds of ways, but really in this parsha we get into a lot of the minutiae of it, a lot of the very specific elements. And as I mentioned last night, there are differences between the rabbis as to whether or not each particular pasuk should be read on its own. In other words, that it stands on its own, that each law is unique to itself and it's simply in a non-sequential kind of order. And there are those that suggest that, of course, that there is a relationship between each of them and they appear in their place because they're related to an idea that contains all of these different laws and statutes. So I want to focus on one that I've certainly talked about before in the past, but sort of connecting to, unfortunately, something not so positive that happened and I just heard about in the last 24 hours in the land of Israel. And I'll get to that point in a second, but I want to address the first idea of it because it is the basis for a larger halachic, a larger Jewish legal principle, which I think a lot of times is the basis actually for some great tension and challenge that relates to what I will mention in a little bit about what happened in Israel. So the last of the mishpat, right, the rules, the statutes that are listed in the fifth aliyah that I'm going to read, is in verse 19, where it says, and it's really a sort of two-parter, it says that the first fruits of your soil you shall bring to the house of your God Adonai. Okay, so that part is one thing, but then you get what's seemingly very different direction. Lo tevashel gedi bechelav imo. You shall not boil a kid, that is, a baby goat, in its mother's milk. Okay, so from here, this is the basis for a significant portion of the laws of kashrut, especially those that relate to the mixing of meat and milk together. So again, if we read the pshat reading of the text here, it seems to be talking about something rather specific, right? The idea of not cooking a baby animal in the milk from its own mother. And as I've talked about before with this verse, this was not it was not intended, at least in my estimation, to be a general statement, but something really much more specific, which is really about this sort of cruelty of treating a baby animal. First of all, to kill it, there are circumstances in which that takes place, but then to do the added cruelty of having the mother's milk be the source of its cooking is something that hits to the emotional level more than anything else. It feels cruel, and therefore there is a prohibition against it. So later on, the rabbis of the Talmudic era, the Mishnaic era, take this as the basis for expanding outwards and suggesting that it's not about just a specific animal and its mother, but it's actually about the idea of cooking any meat in any kind of milk. And even further than that, they take it to even fowl, to birds, which are not mentioned in any way, shape, or form in this pasuk. And eventually the rabbis determined that even something like chicken cannot be mixed together with milk in any form. So what does this have to do with anything other than it's an interesting conversation in its own right? This is an example of a tension that exists in rabbinic thought, in halachic thought, in Jewish legal thought, that refers to two sets of statutes that are interrelated to each other. One is known in Aramaic as deoraita, which means that it is Torah-based, and the other is derabanan, which should sound a little bit familiar, right? Rav, rabbi, that's from a rabbinic kind of perspective. In other words, there are laws that find their basis in the Torah itself, and there are laws that the rabbis created based upon what they learned from the Torah or from inherited oral tradition. So there is, as I said, something of a tension between these two, because they are not necessarily always in concert. Every once in a while you will find a conflict between something that the Torah expects of us, right, halacha midioraita, the halacha that's developed from the Torah itself, and those that are the rabbanon that are developed by the rabbis. And in an instance in which there is any kind of even a seeming disagreement between the two, you are meant to follow the deoraita, the Torah law, over the rabbinic law. Why? Fairly self-evident, which is Torah, right, is directly God-given onto the parchment, so to speak, right, by Moses' hand. The oral tradition, even though the traditionists understand that it was given at the same time, always has a sort of, not, I would say, a secondary status, but simply sort of a 1A or 1A, 1B kind of scenario, in which if there really is a push and shove, we're meant to go deoraita, okay, and the Rabbanan falls to the side. So what does this have to do with what I'm thinking about that I heard about in Israel? So for those of you that were with us this summer, you may remember we had a wonderful presentation by a few of the representatives of Women of the Wall, an incredible group of people who have been working together for decades to try to create a more understanding and open-minded Judaism practiced in Israel vis-a-vis the ability for women, for example, to pray comfortably in the holiest place in our tradition, which is the Western Wall and the Kotel, is a flashpoint. It's not the only place, as we learned, that Women of the Wall is involved. It's much more far-reaching than that. But ultimately, the Kotel is the place in which the greatest amount of conflict around this issue arises. And for decades, the Women of the Wall have come every Rosh Chodesh to daven at the wall. They bring their Torah, they bring their tefillin, they bring things that the traditional Orthodox world views as unacceptable behaviors for women, and they purposely daven at the wall in their fashion. And as a result of it, they have been accosted both physically and mentally and spiritually. They have had things thrown at them. And once again, another experience happened in the last 48 hours when Anat Hoffman, who is the executive director who spoke and is one of the great leaders of the movement, spoke here at the temple over Zoom over the summer, had hot coffee thrown at her by a yeshiva student. Thankfully, she is okay. Thankfully, she has the kind of resilience that she has, if anything, used this as another fuel to the fire, right, to continue the fight. But those of us, of course, that are watching this in horror are deeply upset by it, right, deeply affected by it. I certainly am. The Kotel is a place that as a child felt very deeply spiritual to me and very holy. And the last time that I was able to visit there, I felt distance from it. And it wasn't an accident. It's because it has become a site of some of the worst atrocities, maybe that's the stronger word. One of the worst examples of when this tension, and I'll explain in a second what I mean, between the Deoraita and the Rabbanan comes into play. So what do I mean by that? The thing that happens at the Kotel, and if you look at pictures, by the way, of the Kotel before 1948 and even really before 1967, there is no mechitza. There's no separation wall between men and women. There's no separation wall between anybody and anybody. It's simply an open space that was continuously expanded so more and more people could have access to it. It was never intended, at least in that way, to be a place that restricted men and women from being able to be and pray together. So what is constructed is what's called a mechitza, right, which is a absolutely common and normal part of virtually every Orthodox community that I can think of. Even the most sort of progressive-minded of them will still have some form of mechitza, even if it is transparent or is meant to be a little bit less affecting, but ultimately separates men and women. Fine. I myself, I give to each Jewish person to determine where they're going to daven and how they're going to live their lives, and there are many people, including my own family, who daven in this fashion and who are incredibly comfortable with the idea of men and women being separated. It's fine, right? And each individual shul Each shul decides for themselves what's the case. At a central place like the Kotel, there shouldn't be any one single Jewish person, let alone one single Jewish group, in charge of that space over all others. Certainly, accommodations would need to be made for people who want to daven separated from each other, but to make equal space for those of us that do want to daven, men and women together. Now, certainly there can be disagreement about this, but to get to the point in which people are throwing hot coffee at a woman wearing a talis, wearing tzitzit, wearing tefillin, carrying a Torah. And let me just say, as bad as hot coffee is, it is not the worst thing that has been thrown in Anat Hoffman or the other women of the wall or the people who have gone along. We have members of our synagogue who were accosted by police at the Kotel when they went to pray alongside the women of the wall in solidarity. So where does this fit into the Doraita and the Rabbanan question? Because the concept of mechitza does not exist anywhere in the Torah. You will not find it anywhere. Even if someone will tell you that the basis for it is in Torah, it is firmly the Rabbanan. It is the creation, ultimately, of rabbinic decisions. And while, again, in individual communities, those decisions may be upheld, and may be upheld in a perfectly positive way. In a shared space, like the Kotel, that kind of mentality is unacceptable. And this young person, this yeshiva student, who presumably is spending all of their day studying our traditions, comes away with the idea that in order to preserve a Derabanan idea of mechitza, they are willing to violate numerous Torah laws about how to treat other people, let alone your fellow Jewish people. And of course, this doesn't start with the yeshiva student. It starts with the yeshiva student's teachers. And we learn from other places in this week's Parsha that we must be very careful about following the leadership of those who would lead us in the direction of wickedness. I don't care what passionate feelings there are. There is no justifiable explanation for throwing something that is absolutely, without question, going to hurt another person, simply to prove what we perceive to be a halachic point. And certainly, as I said, if we're going to go down the path of trying to justify behaviors by religious obligation, then certainly we must understand that preserving something that is derabanan, like a mechitza, and violating any number, as I said, of violations just from this week's parsha of what the Torah tells us about how to behave, to me is unacceptable. And the behavior of it, as I said, the responsibility for it, falls on the shoulders of the rabbis themselves. The rabbis of the Kotel, the rabbis of the yeshivot, and ultimately speaking, the chief rabbis of the state of Israel. Now I realize this is my perspective, my point, and I realize that I'm coming in with biases. There's no way to get around that. But I'm not trying to argue this on bias. I'm trying to argue this by the tradition itself and the principles that it upholds. And when people are being instructed to go to the Kotel and to do what they can to humiliate and even to hurt and potentially seriously hurt people whose only intention is to come and worship their God in the way in which the Torah instructs, by reading the Torah, by laying tefillin, by putting on tzitzit, this is a deeply troubling reality that I think we all must acknowledge and face. We certainly have many things going on here at home that are drawing our attention, but I'm worried that we are paying less and less attention to what is going on in Israel. And this is just simply the latest example of what is going on at presumably our holiest site. It breaks my heart. It breaks my heart, and it seems to indicate that we have gotten really too far away from studying the Torah itself. That we have studied too much, in fact, of the rabbinic reflections and refractions of what the Torah is ultimately trying to teach us. So I certainly didn't want to bring a negative idea into our Shabbat this morning, but I simply couldn't allow this to lie, especially as we are studying a parsha that is so full of expectation and mitzvah and law. It seems to me that it is a gross violation of which no one is taking real responsibility. And I think that if we don't do something about this, if there is no way to reconcile this, it is eventually going to cause an even greater rift between the Jewish people. And I think that if that doesn't worry all of you as it does me, then we are really in serious trouble. So I hope that while these words might be slightly less upbeat, as I try to be in most Shabbat, please take them with the seriousness with which they are offered. And if you don't know about what I'm speaking, educate yourselves. Learn more about the women of the wall, what is going on at the Kotel, who is responsible, and how to ultimately hold them accountable. And for me, I hope and pray that on this Shabbat, perhaps all of us, as we study this Torah portion together,
that we will start to see a little bit more of again, what really is at stake here and what really matters. So with that, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. And a reminder again, we're going to be reading from the 5th Aliyah this morning, which begins with the 6th verse of chapter 23. If you are following at home and you are in the Women's Torah Commentary, you are looking for page 439, and if you are in the Plav Chumash, you are looking for page 520.
Baruch Hu et Adonai Amborach. Baruch Adonai Amborach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'torah. Amen lo tateh mishpat evyonecha berivo. Midvar sheker tirchak v'naki v'atzadik al taharok ki lo atzdik rasham v'shochad lo tikach ki ha-shochad Ye'aber pikchim, vayislech divrei tzadikim, veger lo tilchatz, ve'atem yedatem et nefesh hager, ki gerim heitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Tiz v'shesh shanim tizra et artzecha, Ve'asafta et tuata, ve'hashvit tishmetena unetashtea, ve'achlu evioni amecha, ve'itram tochal chayat hasadeh, Kin ta'aseh lecharmecha lezeitecha, she'eshet yamim ta'aseh masecha, ubayom hashvi'i tishbot, lema'an yanuach shorecha vechamorecha, vayinafesh ben amatecha vehager. Uvechol asher amarti aleichem tishmeru, v'shem Elohim acherim lo tazkiru, lo yishma al picha, shalosh regalim tachog li bashana, et chag hamatzot tishemor Shivat yamim, tochal mahatzot kasher tziviticha, lemoed chodesh haviv kivo. Yatzahata Mitzrayim lo yera'u panai rekam, V'chag hakatzir bikurei masecha asher tisra basadeh, v'chag ha'asif b'tzeit hashana, ve'osvecha et ma'asecha min hasadeh, shalosh pe'amim bashana, yera'eh kol zechurecha, El penei ha'adon Adonai, lo titzbach al chametz dam zibchi, ve'lo yalin chelev chagi im ad boker, reshit bikurei admatecha tavim, beit Adonai Elohecha, Lo tevashel gedi, Bechelev imo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu torat emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Well, we have our Torah in our midst. We'll turn to page 371 to offer our healing prayer, our Mishnah Berach. And in a moment, I'll read names of those that we know and we are thinking of in our community, but if you have additional names, I'll invite you to share them at the appropriate time. Mishnah Berach Avotenu v'imotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah Hu Yevarech et hacholim ha'elu. As I said, we'll begin by thinking of those that we know of in our community and connected to our community in need of healing. Brianne Matloff, Boris Senderovich, Yerachmiel Ben Hinda, Paloma Chao Juan, Samuel Moskowitz, Audrey Lubo, Evie Romano, Chaim Leib, Andrew Edelman, Robert Posner, Joyce Weinberg, Rick Gold, Stu Pollack, Jane London, Phyllis Silver, Catherine Guarino, Emunah Chava, Sandra Furman, Raina Walsh, Deirdre Klein, Stephanie Skitt, Judy Stern, Miriam Cornfield, Roz Brody, Chana Ruth Bat Sarah, Marlise Silverberg, Susan Spruce, Fagel Tzipora Bat Elisheva Bat Sarah, Richard Gambino, Michelle Sawicki, Idol Basha Bat Yitzchak, Tzvi Menachem Ben Chaim, Rivka Bat Devora, Amy and Gavin Tucker, Janice Kurz, David Dowling, Neil Elliott and Eileen Rosen, Israel Ben Yitzchak, Ben Sion Ben Moshe, Lorraine Danis, Buddy Kossoff, Shelley Newmark, David Kyle Klotman, Rivka Bat Rachel, Sarah Bat Chana, Moshe Eliezer Ben Sivia, Peretz Ben Yehuda, and Leah Bat Naomi. If you're thinking of anyone else this morning who is in need of healing, please mention their names aloud now or simply hold them in your hearts. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimalei Rachamim Aleihem Lahachalimam L'Rapotam L'Chazikam Ve'Yishlach Lahem Me'era Refuah Shlema Min HaShamayim Refuat HaNefesh Refuat HaGuf Hashta B'Agalav Zman Kariv B'Nomar Amen. May the one who blessed our ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those who are suffering. May the Blessed Holy One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored and their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send them a complete renewal of body and spirit, and let us say together, Amen. El Narifana La, El Narifana La, El Narifana La, Refuah Shelema, El Narifana Lo, El Narifana Lo, El Narifana Lo, Refuah Shelema. I'll invite you to rise in body or spirit as we turn back to page 370 as the Torah is lifted and dressed. Yamod Hamagbia Ve'agolel. Vezot HaTorah Asher Sam Moshe Lifnei Bnei Yisrael Al Pi Adonai Be'ad Moshe. Torah, 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 Tziva Lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Tziva Lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Tziva Lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Tziva Lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 Tziva Lanu Moshe. If you're standing, please be seated. So our Haftarah this morning is a special Haftarah. This is what is referred to as Shabbat Shekalim. So you may not actually have it easily accessible at home unless you have the Plat Chumash. But if you have the Plat Chumash, it's on page 1451.
And if not, you're looking for the second book of Kings, chapter 12, verses 5 to 16. And as you can see, that one of the great things, again, about the Cloud Chumash, it gives our explanation about this particular Shabbat and why it is what it is and why it's called Shabbat Shekalim. So leading up to Passover, this is the first of a series of 5 special Shabbatot. It's really amazing to think that we're almost at Pesach again, because that marks really, really a year of COVID and everything that's come from it. So we add this special supplement to the weekly Sidra, which we didn't read, but featuring the Torah reading focuses on making contributions to maintain communal institutions. So basically what normally happens in this case is that we would be reading from another section of the Torah as one of the final readings of the morning, and it relates to this idea of the shekel tax, essentially, what was gifted to the temple in order to maintain it. And it was an expectation, really, of basically everybody who could. It was a half shekel that is part of that tax. But in any case, this is a description, ultimately, of how those shkalim are ultimately taken in. And just a reminder, again, that in the state of Israel today, right, the denomination of money is referred to, actually these days, as NIS, the New Israeli Shekel. At some point in my childhood, it switched from an older version. They I think for economic reasons, they essentially reissued money in a new fashion, and it did all sorts of things that I don't even remember exactly what. But this idea, again, that in the modern state of Israel, there are so many things that are meant to be drawn from the ancient experience of the Israelites as well. And so the choice, again, of using shekel as the obvious choice for the denomination may not seem so obvious to everybody else, but to us it's a connecting point. So in any case, our reading will begin again on page 1451. If you're following again in some other form online, you're looking for the second book of Kings, chapter 12, verses 5 to 16. And we'll begin by offering our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'miim tovim v'ratza b'divreihem hanemarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai הבוחר בתורה ובמשה עבדו וישראל עמו וליהיה האמת והצדק. Yehoash said to the priests, "Let all the money brought into the house of the Eternal as a sacred gift, whether it be money one is required to pay, money for which each person is assessed, or money brought as a freewill offering, be taken by the priests, each from the one who is making the gift, and used by them to make repairs in the temple whenever it is found that repairs are needed." But by the 23rd year of King Yehoash, the priests had not made any repairs in the temple. So the king called in Yehoiada, let me just see how it's spelled in Hebrew. Leoda. Okay, I'll have to look this up another time, make sure that I'm pronouncing everyone's name correctly. And the other priests, and said to them, "Why haven't you been repairing the temple? From now on, you are not to keep the money from your donors. You are to hand it over for the repair of the temple." And the priests agreed that they would no longer receive money from the people, and that they would no longer be responsible for the repair of the temple. When the priest took a chest, made a hole in its lid, and placed it in the right of the altar, as one enters the house of the Eternal, the priests on guard at the entrance put into all the money that was brought into the house of the Eternal. And whenever they saw that there was a good deal of money in the chest, the royal scribe and the high priest would go up and count the money found in the house of the Eternal and put it into bags. After the money had been weighed out, they would give it to the artisans in charge of the work at the house of the Eternal. Then they would pay the carpenters and the builders who worked there, and the masons and the stone cutters. They also brought wood and cut stone for the repair of the house of the Eternal, and all the other expenses for the repair of the temple. But the money that was not brought to the house of the Eternal was not used to make silver cups, snuffers, basins, trumpets, or any gold or silver vessels. It was given to the artisans, using it to repair the house of the Eternal. No detailed accounting was made with those to whom the silver was given to pay the artisans, because they worked under contract. Now, this, I'm sure, sounds like a very different kind of reading than we normally have, quite mundane in some kind of ways, but actually really quite profound in others. All right, the idea that there is a sense here of a certain kind of corruption that is taking place, in which the donations are being made, and they are being made with the assumption that those donations are going towards the building and the maintenance of the temple itself, whether they're coming, again, as required ones or free will offerings. And so the concern was that basically what's being described at the beginning is that since this was happening, each individual priest essentially was getting the money directly from whoever was offering the sacrifice. Not all of that money was making it to where it needed to go. So instead they basically instituted the first pushka, a big receptacle in which money was placed in, and it was placed in regularly, and only after it had filled up did two of the most reputable people, right, the sacred treasurer and the high priest, go and count the money, and then to use it exactly for what it was intended for in the first place. So again, a reminder that although there are systems in place, always systems in place, our ancestors still relied on ideas of accountability, right? And the willingness to change a system that's in place in order to ensure that the accountability is really there and that corruption is not taking place. So again, just a reminder that just because the temple got built did not mean that there was not always a concern about how the temple is being used and how easy it is to be corrupted. So again, going back to my drash, we have to really think about, how are we holding the accountability and how are we making sure that the temple and its remnant that still exists in the Western Wall is not being corrupted. So, I'll now offer the concluding blessing. We're back in our prayer books, page 372. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol haolamim, tzadik b'chol hadorot, ha'el ha'ne'eman ha'omer ve'oseh, ha'mdaber u'mkayem, shekol devarav emet v'tzedek, על התורה ועל העבודה ועל הימים ועל יום השבת הזה שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה לכבוד ולתפארת על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך יתברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת Amen. For we return the Torah to the ark, you rise in body or spirit as we turn to page 376 to offer our prayer for our country, and then on 377 a prayer for the state of Israel. Thus says Adonai, this is what I desire, to unlock the fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of lawlessness, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. Share your bread with the hungry and take the wretched poor into your home. And when you see the naked, give clothing and do not ignore your own kin. If you banish the yoke from your midst, the menacing hand, the evil speech, if you offer compassion to the hungry and satisfy the famished creature, then your light shall shine in darkness. O guardian of life and liberty, may our nation always merit your protection. Teach us to give thanks for what we have by sharing it with those who are in need. Keep our eyes open to the wonders of creation and alert to the care of the earth. May we never be lazy in the work of peace, and may we honor those who have died in defense of our ideals. Grant our leaders wisdom and forbearance. May they govern with justice and compassion. Help us all to appreciate one another and to respect the many ways that we may serve you. May our homes be safe from affliction and strife, and our country be sound in body and spirit. Amen. And our prayer for the state of Israel, page 377. Avinu shebashamayim sur Yisrael v'goalo barech et medinat Yisrael reshit tzmichat gulatenu. Hagen alea bevrat chastecha ufros alea sukat shalomecha. Ushlach orcha v'amitcha l'rasheha sareha v'yoatzeha. V'takdem be'etzah tova milfanecha v'natata shalom ba'aretz v'simchat olam le'yoshveha v'nomar. Amen. O Heavenly One, Protector and Redeemer of Israel, bless the state of Israel which marks the dawning of hope for all who seek peace. Shield it beneath the wings of your love, spread over it the canopy of your peace. Send your light and truth to all who lead and advise, guiding them with your good counsel. Establish peace in the land and fullness of joy for all who dwell there. Amen. You remain standing in body or spirit as we turn back to page 374 as the Torah is returned to the ark. Ya'alelu et Shem Adonai, ki nizkav shemo levado, odo al eretz v'shamayim, vayarem keren li'amo, tehila lechol chasida, ibnei Yisrael am kerovo. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Ki lekach tov natati lachem, Torati al tazovu, et chayim ehi
למחזיקים בה ותומכיה מאושר דרכיה דרכי נועם וכל נתיבותיה שלום השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה חדש חדש ימינו חדש ימינו כקדם. Remain standing in body or spirit as we turn to page 586 at the bottom of the page. Aleinu l'shabeach. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה שלא שם חלקנו כהם לגור עלינו ככל המונם ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. Page 588. שהוא נוטה שמיים ועושה הארץ ומשה מקרו בשמיים ממעל ושכינתו זו בגובה מרומים הוא אלוהינו אין עוד אמת מלכנו אפס זולתו ככתוב בתורתו וידעת היום ועל שמות לבביך כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל ועל הארץ מתחתנו. And now on bottom of page 591. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Invite those in mourning and those observing a yard site to remain standing in body or spirit as we first remember those who have passed in recent months. Miles Ambrose, Fred Eber, Nancy Fisher, Saul Fisher, Edwin Friedman, Sandra Friedman, Lucy Gladstone, Lois Herr, Phyllis Katz, Laura Kurz, Madge Judith Parcher, Steve Popkin, Vera Shaps, Norma Small, Marjorie Weinberg Berman, and Ann Weiss. We also mark the yard sites that occurred during the last week for Gustav Amsterdam, Ola Auerbach, Freddie Bernstein, Phyllis Britz, Irving Busgang, Annette Fisher, Ada Glass, Sheila Glazer, Deborah Greenberg, Roberta Herbert, Bernard Kalkstein, Frank Levitt, Louis Liu, Myrna Massoff, Theodore Meyer, Eva Nadell, Gussie Peller, Emma Rosen, Stanley Schneider, Mildred Schockett, Caroline Schreiber, Marcus Spitz, Jack Spivak, Anna Steinberg, Betty Tobias, Morris Weinberg, and Marvin Weiss. If you have a name from someone for whom you're saying Kaddish this morning that we did not share, please take this time to share the names aloud. We join now together on page 598 as we recite the mourner's Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divra chirutei ve'amlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, v'agalav v'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam le'almei almayer. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudsha barichu. Le'ila min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran ve'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shalom rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Zichronam livracha. Every one of their memories be for a blessing. Can you please be seated at home if you're still standing? Shabbat Shalom, everybody. A few important announcements. First, of course, is to join us for Torah study beginning at 12 o'clock on Zoom.
If you don't know how to access it, please do let me know. I'll be happy to bring you in. And again, no prior knowledge necessary whatsoever. Also a reminder that tomorrow at 2 o'clock, we're very excited to welcome back our beloved teacher and friend, Dasi Berkowitz, who's going to be joining us from the land of Israel via Zoom to talk about her new book, Becoming a Soulful Parent, A Path to the Wisdom Within, which is going to be really a lovely, remarkable opportunity really to learn from one of the great teachers. It's a beautiful book, it's a meaningful book, and as I have explained, it is definitely not restricted only to parents. It really is a book in many ways about relationships. And so there's a lot to be taken in there, and again, if you're a grandparent, uncle, an aunt, if you have other people in your life for whom you are ever in charge or care of, and also if you just missed Dasi, this is a great chance to see her. So you can be on the stream, on the Zoom with us. We're also going to stream it out to everybody as well. There will be time for Q&A. That would be the only stuff that will turn the streaming off to make sure that there is a private enough space for people to ask questions that they feel comfortable asking. So again, tomorrow, 2 o'clock, register online or watch the stream on our Facebook, YouTube, or website. Also coming up this week, Nina Mitzvah will be meeting on Monday at 11:30. However, there will be no Hebrew school because of President's Day. The Social Justice Committee will continue to have its regular meeting at 5 o'clock virtually. On Wednesday, my class on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Prophets will be at 12 o'clock, and the B'nai Mitzvah class will not be because of winter break. At 7 o'clock Wednesday evening will be the continuation of a panel discussion that we had last month with myself, my father, Peter Geffen, and Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the South Fork, as we discussed the movie Shared Legacies, which we watched, but the conversation as inevitably will go beyond just the film itself. So if you're interested in joining us, and if you missed the first part, contact our social justice chairs, Andy and Alyssa, and they will share the video, which you can certainly watch at your leisure. Also a reminder, this is really wonderful and important. On Thursday, a new Chug Briut, as it is called, a health and wellness committee, which has been organized and run by our friend and board member and teacher here, Brad Tepper, Dr. Brad Tepper, I should say, and a number of other members of our community, Ann Silver and Ari Weller and Dr. Philip Landkowski, if I remember correctly, that are working in various forms of what we would call healthcare and wellness. And so, of course, we're thinking about within our community how to focus on how we can preserve and maintain and even strengthen our sense of wellness and well-being during COVID times in particular. So we have a number of experts who are giving of their time to really help us kind of process and think. I'll be joining them as well for this really important conversation, again, Thursday at 7 o'clock. My class on Pirkei Avot will meet on 9 o'clock on Friday, and just a reminder that Purim is, of course, coming up at the end of the month on February 25th. The humor group will be returning with their hilarious Purim Star Wars, and of course, Megillah reading. And as a reminder, always check your e-blast, check your calendars, check the website, make sure that you're up to date on everything. If you're not getting communication for any reason, please let Eileen know in the office. And last word is that if you weren't on the call last night, our Cantor Lauren, our beloved Cantor Lauren, has what's called a practicum at HUC. As you may remember from our previous student cantors, it's one of the yearly requirements of the cantorial program. So obviously this year we can't go in person, but it will be happening on Vimeo, if I'm not mistaken. And Cantor Lauren's going to share the link with me, and I'll share with the community. That's going to be Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. So with all of that, I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. Continue to be safe out there, and welcome everybody to our Torah study in just a little bit. Before we do Kiddush, let's conclude our service with a, I think, Ein Keloheinu, and we'll do Ein Keloheinu on page 626. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadoneinu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadoneinu, Michemalkeinu, Michemoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adoneinu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adoneinu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adoneinu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu. And we'll turn back just a few pages for Kiddush, which can be found on page 604. Veshamru Bnei Israel et HaShabbat
לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. ביני ובין ובני ישראל אותי לעולם, אותי לעולם. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני את השמיים ואת הארץ, ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם לברית עולם. וביום השביעי שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש, שבת וינפש. ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת, לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. על כן ברך אדוני את יום השבת ויקדשהו סברי לחיים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, מורד פרי הגפן. Amen. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And I should say also a happy Adar. Let us begin the month of Adar in joy, and may it end in joy. And really take care of yourselves as always. Please be safe out there. And I hope to see you on Torah study in just a little bit. Shabbat Shalom.